Today we'll be talking with Dr. Anamaria Berea about her work in the emergence of communication in biological and social networks. With PhDs in economics and computational social sciences, something I have to ask you about, Dr. Berea is an associate professor of data sciences at George Mason University in Virginia, a research scholar in astrobiology for the Blue Marble Space Institute of Science, affiliated faculty with NASA's Frontier Development Lab, and a research affiliate for the SETI Institute. Her research focuses on the emergence of communication in social and biological networks as an evolving complex system. She is currently studying the natural language of stars, which is pretty cool sounding, actually. Anyway, so welcome to our podcast, Dr. Berea.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gerner. It's very good to be here.
So you are one of the members of this Research Alliance for Regenerative Economics, which we both belong to. And part of our argument is that we believe today's systemic problems require an integrated multidisciplinary approach. Mm-hmm. And because communication and societal learning are central to such an integrated approach, because culture, including our beliefs and values, are central to societal outcomes. So I'm really curious about how your work is increasing or adding to our understanding of how communication plays into all of this and how it emerges. So can you tell us something about what you've discovered about how communication emerges in biological and social networks?
Yeah, thank you so much. This is really a great question, and the reason why I arrived or ended up with communication as a research field has been through complex systems, basically, because when we study complex systems such as societies or economies or groups or humans in general, we are looking at the interactions, right, between the different members of the groups, the different institutions, and the different agents. But we haven't really paid attention too much to exactly the nature of these interactions and all these interactions that we sometimes even end up modeling, and we sometimes end up looking at how they lead to other systems or other to emergence. We haven't paid close detail into the actual communications and information exchange that happens through these interactions. And if we are looking at communication per se, we discover very quickly that communication per se is a complex system that keeps on evolving, because we can think of communication not just in our social systems, in our economies, between different humans, different organizations, or between individuals and organizations, but we find communication with deep roots in other complex systems in what we call life. So it's very quickly that we discover that communication is one of those fundamental properties of life, that there are no animal species or plant species or even bacteria or microorganisms that can survive without some form of communication. So of course, when we are talking about communication, we can talk about it in different ways, and it depends on how we define it. But if we are to include signaling or chemical or electrical or electromagnetism into aspects or different forms of information exchange and communication, then we can definitely say that communication is a property of life, and therefore of complex systems, and that evolves and has evolved with the complex systems themselves. So again, when we are looking at the interconnections, and we are looking at the evolution of all these different systems in the history of life, but also in the history of our society, we quickly discovered that communication is a fundamental part of it.
Wow, there we go. So how do you go about studying natural languages in these different kinds of systems?
It's very broad, and it's also very interesting and very interdisciplinary. Again, there are different ways in which we can look at
Hold on one second, please. Okay, sorry about that.
Oh, no problem at all. No problem at all. Yeah.
So we were asking about how do you study these natural languages in these different kinds of things?
Yeah, so we start basically by exploring the phenomenon itself. Again, because we have different ways of looking at communication. Communication for humans is something completely different than, let's say, cellular communication, when two cells are communicating with each other, which is basically electrical and chemical signaling, right? So depending on the medium of communication, we can look at communication in different ways. Certainly we are talking about different ways of signaling at the cellular level, at the molecular level, also different ways of communication when we are looking at different animal species, and then we are looking at signaling or more auditory or olfactory type of communication, or even seismic type of communication if we are thinking about the elephants that are thumping with their feet on the ground so that they can send signals 30 kilometers away. Again, depending on the medium and the species, we are looking at this differently. Now, of course, when we are talking about humans, and by extension through technology, even computers, and let's say by extension into artificial intelligence, we are talking about, again, a different type of communication. While like other animals, we can, or animal species, we can communicate through auditory signals, through olfactory signals. Our main medium of communication is through language, something that other animal species do not possess. And by extension, we have also designed computer languages that right now different algorithms are using, interpreting, or even developing, because we have meta algorithms that are starting to develop different computer languages, right? So it's very interesting if we are looking in the whole evolutionary space, or if we are looking at a very large scale, where we are trying to understand the phenomenon from the origin of life all the way to the technological developments of our civilization. Then we are finding all these different facets of the medium of interactions, the type of interaction. And at the end of the day, what we are talking about is a form of information exchange. I think it all boils down to how we perceive and interpret information, and how information is being exchanged in living systems.
So how do you differentiate between I don't know, an elephant stomping his foot that has no meaning whatsoever, and one that was communicating something?
That's a very good question. So we are not doing a very good job just yet at completely understanding the communication in other species. We are only now trying to, scientists, researchers, biologists in particular, they are deciphering some meaning behind the way different species communicate, for instance, in dolphins, or in whales, or in apes, in the big apes, right? Mostly we know we understood them is through repeated interaction. And whether we can also interact with some of these species in a meaningful way. So again, we haven't done a very good job just yet into completely understanding this, but right now we have more and more data, and researchers have done a great job collecting a lot of information through video recordings, audio recordings, and what we can do now is, in addition to the expertise of the experts who have been working with individual species for decades, we also can use computational tools to try to decipher and understand these languages. And some of the earliest papers that I've seen published in this space are about using, for example, machine learning, trying to understand the clicks and states in dolphin languages, where we have more data that we have gathered over the years.
Okay, so is a lot of this pattern recognition when you say machine learning?
There is some pattern recognition. There is also trying to understand individual audio sounds, and then if we are playing back those audio sounds, if the dolphins, understand us. So, but when we are talking just about the machine learning algorithm per se, it is about pattern recognition. It is also about understanding what each of those individual sounds, what they mean, but also how do we parse into individual sounds. Because an audio file is basically a long time series. And how do we parse through that data in a way that is meaningful for us to analyze it and to interpret it. And this can lead me actually later on more into understanding the language of the stars and how we are using the same methods to understand the stars.
So could you give me a hint about how you parse things?
So it all boils down to math, right? So if we have audio files, or if we have the luminosity of the stars, all these are time series, essentially.
Right.
So if we're looking at time series as data files, right? As long vectors of different data points, then how do we parse through them so that we can get enough granularity then that we can afterwards reproduce? So think about this in as DNA code, right? So is the DNA code made of four individual letters, or is it made just of different blocks of those four individual letters? So how can we get to those four individual letters in this time series? Whether we are talking about the audio files in dolphin communication, or we are talking about the luminosity of the stars.
It sounds like a challenge to me.
So again, what's interesting about this is that we come down to the idea of information and how we encode and decode information using data.
Okay. So how do you figure this stuff evolved? I mean,
that's an excellent question. We can look at, in general, in living systems, right? So if we are talking about long, complex living systems, I mean long in evolutionary terms, communication itself is very tied to the actual anatomical evolution, right? The way different analyzers and the way the perception has evolved in these systems, because for an organism that doesn't have eyes, that organism will never be able to develop visual communication, right? And it's the same for another organism that cannot communicate through electricity. I mean, we humans, we don't have that type of communication any longer, although you can find that in most species of fish, for example. So the communication itself, that's why it is a complex system, because it has co-evolutionary processes. So you have the evolution of the medium of the information exchange with the actual species, so of the individuals, and overall the co-evolution of the anatomical parts that we are using for communication. A great example here is also why can't we communicate the big apes in the same way that we communicate with other humans. It's because of very small anatomical difference that we have versus the big apes, and that has to do with the way our throats and tongues have developed, which is different, and that's why we can articulate words in this way, while at the same time we can very well communicate with the big apes using the sign language once we teach them the sign language. So what's really interesting about this is the coevolution of the actual physical substrate of communication with the medium of communication. So.
Yeah, actually, I remember reading this wonderful stuff about the aquatic ape by this guy named Alistair Hardy, who talked about the reason we have this ability to hold our breath and the tongue development the way we do is because we probably evolved as apes in these mangrove swamps where you had to learn, you were walking upright mostly because of, you were walking through the water. And then you had to hold your breath periodically. So you co-evolved that. And then, anyway, interesting.
Yeah, you mentioned that to me before, and I found that really interesting and fascinating.
So I was actually thinking more about how you co-evolve meaning with communication.
That's a very good question. So far, from what we know, it's only us humans that can assign meaning to communication. For most of the other species, communication is about. Again, we can definitely go into very lengthy discussions about what is meaning and go into some ideas from the philosophy of science about that. But
because I'm thinking of things like deer flashing their tails as a warning.
Right. So indeed, in most other species, communication is about their immediate environment and their immediate context. So is it communication about mating? Is it communication about predators, prey? Is it communication about finding food? For example, as we see in bees, right? And they have that nice bee dance, right? So that they can point to the other bees where they can find food. It's very different in terms of context. When we are talking about humans, though, we are talking about a more abstract way of communicating and about a more complex language, to which we can assign meaning not just about our survival, but about more abstract concepts that we have developed through our intelligence and awareness.
Right. No, I mean, I'm going to hold off on the human part because I sort of believe you have to get to the earlier parts before you can really figure this out. Another one of those articles that I really loved was this one called Cell Psychology by a guy named Howard Petit.
Yeah.
And he was pointing out that, we take DNA as a code, but in order for it really to be a code, you have to have something that reads it, and then you have to have some kind of essentially effective response. And what we have is actually a code reader system in the DNA, RNA, and protein synthesis impact.
That's right. You have again, this boils down to the idea of information exchange. And in an information, when we have the medium for information exchange, the sender and the receiver have to have the same understanding, or similar, not quite the same, but similar understanding about what is being communicated and how it is being communicated. So this is one of the major barriers between interspecies communication, again, because it's very possible when, if we take the example of the elephants, right, that they are thumping in order to communicate, which is not just the way they communicate. They communicate orally as well, right? Through sounds and through body language, like most animal species. But again, it's something that they can, when we're talking about seismic communication, it's something that they can understand themselves. But again, us or some other species might not have the capacity to understand that, simply because we cannot feel, right, the actual vibrations from the ground. So indeed, it's when we are looking at the two agents or the two entities or the two individuals that are communicating, they have to have a lot of similarity in their physical understanding of the communication and what is being communicated, and also in the abstract, right, understanding again between. Here we can delineate between intra-species communication, so communication between the members of the same species, versus interspecies communication between the members of different species.
So let's see. I can easily see how certain things like the deer flashing their tail could arise accidentally. Is that more or less how you see things arising? So, a deer has a startle reflex and flips his tail up, and if the rest of them run away, then they survive better, and evolves that way.
Yeah, that's one way. So there is like in any other evolutionary process, there is error in communication,
right.
And there is also purposeful deceptive communication, which we see in other species as well, not just in humans. So it's not just humans that lie, right? We actually see that all the way down to the cellular level, where there is deceptive communication has been observed, let's say, between the cells of the mother and of the baby in the womb.
Whoa!
So there is, and again, just like you were mentioning about the DNA and the cell psychology, and how you need the receptor to re-encode that. When you do the re-encoding, there might be some error, right? And that error, imperfect, I would call it imperfect communication. We can find it again all the way from the cellular level all the way to humans. And for example, just without any intent of deception, we can misinterpret words, or we can misinterpret communication from another one of our peers. And that's how languages have actually evolved. And also because our sounds are not perfect, and some sounds the same sound can mean something in a culture and something completely different in a different culture. And we can have different ways of pronouncing the letter A, right? We can have A, and so on, right? And through different errors of pronunciation, which maybe they have been they are backed by some anatomical deficiencies, or not necessarily, just maybe through some differences in the two cultures of two different groups. Then we have the evolution of certain words, right? Again, if we are looking just linguistically in the history of the languages, we can see that different words have evolved differently and have also expanded differently in other languages. Like let's take the most basic word, mama, right, which is mother in most languages, and you can have mom, mama, right? There are different ways in which you can pronounce, and it has been expanded in different cultures.
Well, that's interesting. Okay, so about the whole thing about error, this is one of those fractal things for me. So there's another one of those articles. This one is about ant trails and leaving pheromone trails out to find something. And they find that about 15%, so some ant finds food, and then leaves a pheromone trail back to the hive. And then the other ants follow it, but 15% of them fall off the trail and leave a false pheromone trail off someplace else.
Right.
And then some number of ants follow the false trail, and 15% of them fall off that one and leave another false trail. So you get this spread out little,
Yeah.
it's a fractal. And what they show is that it's an optimal search pattern,
Right.
actually, in
Right.
in a logically distributed, if you had a picnic and there's food scattered all over the place, you're more likely to find it if you have some set of errors.
Yeah, that's right. It's great that you're bringing up that example. I was actually watching a documentary the other day about the history of algorithms and how even with these most sophisticated computers that we have right now, we haven't actually been able to completely and optimally resolve the salesman travel problem.
Right? Yes. That was classic when I was in grad school.
Yeah, but the experiments that they've done with bees, they actually show that bees are quite great at solving this problem. They are not solving it perfectly, but they have the best solution for what is the shortest path between or the shortest route between different sources of food that are placed in spatially in very different points in space. So yeah.
And is there is it related to the fractal errors? So you have these things that are.
Yes, but also to optimizing the routes. So again, they start by I don't know, instinctively taking a certain route, but then they optimize on that route and they go again and again and again. So it's a trial and error. But they find it very quickly, that's what's really interesting about it. Very quickly, they arrive to one common route that they will all take to visit all the sites that they have for the different sources of food.
And so there's no way to know how they managed to do that.
We don't know the how. We just observe the pattern that they did it, that they are better than our computers at doing it, but we don't know how. Yeah.
There's a lot of these things where I've read this great book called The Hidden Life of Trees, which is a lot about. You read this, and it's a lot about this communication between tree species.
Yes, that's right. They have this network of this mycelium, this network of mushrooms underground through which they send these chemical signals. From
right, and sometimes they will exude kind of bad smells to keep predators away. Yes. They'll take care of trees that have fallen over and are hurting. And
yes. What I found really interesting in that book was also the different perception of time. Because the author he basically mentioned there why actually in plants and particularly in trees we see a slower response to predators because they perceive time differently. They are evolutionary. They are much older than animal species.
Well, yeah.
And for trees, 10 years is like a year for another species, right? So time is, again, it's something also that we should keep in mind when we are talking about communication as well. So, yeah.
So, okay, let's see. I'm having a senior moment here. Let's see. I know one of the things that also fascinates me, because I'm big into the fractal stuff, is the fact that natural languages seem to have these fractal patterns or power law patterns in them.
Yes, yeah.
So why should that be? And do you use any of that in your study of languages, and how do you discern what is and is not a language or a signal?
Yeah, so it's so the zip law, which is power law with the power of -1, has been observed originally in human languages, right? So there was this paper published by Zip in the 40s where he showed that regardless of the language, so it doesn't matter if it's English or Chinese or German, that the vocabulary of that language follows this zip law. So basically we have a few words that we use very frequently, and we have most words, right, in the vocabulary that we use quite infrequently. And this has been extended afterwards and has been tested for other species, and it has been observed in dolphin interactions, and it has been observed in whales interactions. So it's not necessarily just a property of the human languages, but it has not been observed yet in computer languages. So, so we are I guess one way in which we can think of this ZIF distribution or ZIF test is whether a language is natural or not, right? And this is how it has been used sometimes to, in some of the more recent research, to distinguish between, let's say on social media, if we have humans talking versus bots talking. It's not a perfect test, but it's a good indicator for us to understand whether in an online environment we have humans talking versus designed bots that are talking to each other.
And how does this work into your natural language of stars?
That is the great question. So in the natural language of stars, we started going back to what I was saying about the time series. We started with this idea of can we parse, or can we partition the luminosity of stars into individual components that would be a great proxy for the DNA of stars, right? So we are looking for the DNA of stars and to characterize the stars based on these patterns. The trick there is to transform the numbers or the data points from the time series into words, or what we call in natural language processing is we call that a gram or n-gram. So a word is 1 gram, 2 words is 2 grams, and so on. So again, how do we partition these time series so that we can have, instead of a vector of data points, we have a vector of n grams, right? The idea here is, okay, that we want to create the DNA of the stars to have a better characterization and classification of the stars, but also to potentially simulate stars that can exist, but we have not observed yet. Now, why use natural language processing for this? Because it sounds quite esoteric. It's right. It's a
charming.
method. Yeah, it's a method, or it's actually a bunch of methods that we, a group of methods that, or methodology that we designed to understand human languages. We didn't design that for astronomy or for stars. But again, the idea here is that if we actually want to catalog these stars, then we can look at the ways we have done taxonomies and cataloging and vocabularies in human languages, and do the same for other type of phenomena. Now, going back to your question about the ZIF law, what we have observed is that when we repeatedly try different methods for parsing this time series and cutting them into different bits and pieces, one of the methods that was basically inspired by the ZIF law, where we are trying to put the data points to fit them into a ZIF distribution and then create the n-grams from that, it was that method that actually rendered the best results for us in terms of classifying the stars that have similar patterns and have them classified into the same group. So that's where that comes in here.
Huh, interesting. Okay, so how does any of this relate to making a more systemically healthy society?
Yeah, so that's the number one question, right? Again, when we are talking about the evolution of societies, and we are talking about societies as complex systems, we have looked, and researchers have looked into depth and have modeled and simulated the evolution of societies under different circumstances, whether we are talking about economies, or whether we are talking about cooperation or competition. But again, we haven't closely pay attention to the interactions here, to the way individuals within a society, how they communicate and how that reflects into some emergent patterns, or to the communication between different subgroups or organizations in the society, and how that reflects into the emergence of different patterns. Because it's not just that words matter, right? And that, you can conquer more with words than with swords, right? But we do know that miscommunication, that deceptive communication, for instance, and we show that actually through a series of our simulations, how they actually lead to less trustworthy societies. On another hand, we also show that when we have more communication interactions and we have more propensity for open communication, that leads to more to societies that are more trusting and that they are more open. So
Right.
yeah.
Do they learn better, or can you tell?
We assume that I cannot tell that right now. We are still looking at some features in those simulations. We are trying to understand also the role of entropy, which is something.
It's another one of our conversations. Yes.
Yeah, which is another conversation. So. But definitely we can see the role of communication as it plays out into groups for how trustworthy or how less trustworthy those groups become.
Well, I mean, obviously that relates a lot to what's going on now within a world of alternative facts and,
Right.
fake media and fake news
Right.
and things like that. And no one knows who to trust anymore. It's just crazy.
Yeah, that's right.
Is there some reason why we would be heading this way?
I don't know. So I think personally, I think that the wealth of information that we are drowning in. So talking about information versus meaning, right? It's become more difficult to extract meaning from all this information exchange that we are having on a daily basis nowadays. In the past, we had meaning from different information that was more or less given to us by, let's say, experts or institutions. Think about the way the English dictionary has evolved. Originally it was a group of scholars that would say, this is the correct way to use this word, this is the correct way to spell or write this word. But now we have a lot of noise and we have a lot of information, and we are yet to see what emerges out of all these interactions. And sometimes what we see as emergence is very polarized opinions. So it's not necessarily that we are converging towards a truth or how should I say, or towards a more unified or cooperative view of a topic, right? But that we see this, that for different topics, we see this emerging into more groups or more polarized, in a more polarized way. So we don't have that clear, emergence of one thing or one global thing. We see that into a spread out, basically. So,
of course, part of my theory is that we're witnessing the death throes of oligarchy, which is hierarchy run by and for the maximum profit for a few people on top, and that we're essentially, and that it has incentivized a lot of this polarization and a lot of this deceit and things like that, and that we're basically going to have to work our way out of that, and that's probably the biggest challenge of our time.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. We do have in data science this theoretical thing that we say that data is not information, information is not data. How do we transform one into the other? And it's here where we still have a lot of bias right? And it's a bias that transfers all the way to into our artificial intelligence algorithms, because they are
Right.
informed by our
Yes,
data,
exactly right. Your assumption set it
and they
goes
are
into them.
designed right by us.
Yeah.
So so there is this will, I guess we'll have to wait and see how things will
Well,
evolve. Yeah,
I mean, there really is such a thing as emergence, and
yeah,
emergence is essentially unpredictable. You can't tell
exactly. In
what's
both
it going to.
emergence, yeah,
Yeah,
both emergence and evolution are unpredictable. So
right.
yeah,
I mean, they follow certain laws, but what is exactly going to be produced by them at any given moment is
right.
another thing. Anyway, well, thank you very much. This has been very enlightening, and I think that's all for now.
My pleasure. I loved it.
Take care.
Yeah, bye.